In the vaults of the British Museum, there lies a palm-sized clay tablet that could rewrite our understanding of the world's earliest cartography, and perhaps of biblical history itself. To the untrained eye, it appears almost unremarkable, a circular etching surrounded by faint wedges of cuneiform, worn smooth by time. Yet within this fragile disk of baked clay lies the first known map of the world, drawn by a Babylonian scholar over 2,500 years ago. For centuries, scholars viewed it as a symbolic cosmological image, a spiritual diagram of the universe. But new discoveries have revealed something far more concrete. This map may not only depict the actual geography of the ancient world, it may also record the true resting place of Noah's Ark. The object in question, known as the Babylonian Map of the World or Imago Mundi, dates from the 6th century BC, a time when Babylon stood as the intellectual heart of the known world. At its center runs the Euphrates River, the lifeblood of Mesopotamia, and beside it is the rectangular shape of Babylon itself, the city of kings and astronomers. Around this inner landscape, the scribe incised a double circle labeled the Bitter River, representing the great ocean that encircled the habitable world. Beyond this ring stretch a series of triangles, 8 in total, pointing outward like rays from the sun. Yet there was something peculiar about them. The cuneiform text describing each outer land hinted at precise directions, measurable distances, and even topographical features. This was not mythology, it was cartography. The Babylonians, it seems, had charted their world with astonishing accuracy. Among these distant realms, one triangle stood out. Its inscription, rediscovered through the efforts of volunteer researcher Edith Horsley and British Museum curator Irving Finkel, described a great wall, 840 cubits high with trees rising 120 cubits, reachable after crossing the Bitter River for 7 leagues. In its damaged lines appeared a mysterious word, parsiktu. Finkel immediately recognized it. That same term appears only once elsewhere in all of Mesopotamian literature, in the oldest known flood account, the Babylonian story of Atrahasis, the man who built a vast ship to survive a divine deluge. In that text, Atrahasis describes the ark's planks as being as thick as a parsiktu vessel. The presence of this word on the map could not be coincidence. It connected the world's first map directly to the world's first flood narrative, and by extension, to the ark itself. When the fragment was joined to the original tablet, the missing triangle aligned perfectly, showing that this was no random scrap of clay. The parsiktu inscription belonged precisely where one of the outer mountain lands had been missing. Finkel realized that this triangle, the 5th district beyond the Bitter River, described the very mountain where the Babylonian ark had come to rest. The cuneiform lines even mentioned the ribs as thick as parsiktu, a clear allusion to massive wooden beams still visible upon the mountain. In other words, the Babylonians possessed a map that showed where the ark had landed. The implications are breathtaking. Long before Genesis was written, Mesopotamian scholars recorded the aftermath of the Great Flood as a tangible event within their geographic knowledge. The ark was not a symbol of salvation, but a real vessel resting on a real mountain, and its remnants were considered a landmark of divine intervention. The text's geographical markers align closely with the region later known as Urartu, the ancient kingdom encompassing parts of modern-day Armenia and eastern Turkey, and within that region, one mountain dominates both legend and landscape, Mount Ararat. The connection between Urartu and Ararat is linguistically and historically clear. The Hebrew term in Genesis, Har Ararat, derives from the Assyrian name Urartu, which appears directly on the Babylonian map. To the Babylonians, Urartu lay just beyond their northern horizon, a mountainous land associated with the gods and the aftermath of the flood. From the earliest preserved lines of the post-deluge tradition, the geography of Noah's landing place is presented not as a single alpine spike, but as a range. Genesis 8:4 states that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Built into the Hebrew wording is a crucial nuance. Hare Ararat is plural and functions as a regional designation rather than a pinpointed peak. In the idiom of the ancient Near East, Ararat corresponds to the highland kingdom the Assyrians called Urartu, centered around Lake Van and extending across what is now eastern Turkey and parts of Armenia. Read this way, the text directs us to a mountainous zone in the Armenian highlands. As centuries passed, tradition narrowed the focus. Christian iconography and pilgrimage culture gradually elevated a single mountain, today's snow-capped twin-peaked volcanic massif on the Turkish-Armenian frontier, as the Mount Ararat. European travelers and biblical scholars of the 17th–19th centuries set their compasses for Ararat. In dictionaries, surveys, and commentaries, Ararat increasingly became the default site. Augustine Calmet's widely read Dictionary of the Bible from 1722 repeated long-standing reports that remnants of the ark still lay atop the mountain, while candidly judging such claims unproven. The 1829 ascent by Friedrich Parrot, guided by the Armenian scholar Khachatur Abovian, was a seminal moment, not an ark hunt in the modern sense, but the first scientific climb to Ararat's summit. Parrot brought home data, measurements, and a public imagination reignited by the idea that science and scripture could share a horizon. From then on, a steady trickle of reports, ark-like silhouettes above the snow line, caves rimmed with timbers, wood fragments shown by shepherds, entered pilgrims' notebooks and journals. Most were second or third hand, none held up to sustained scrutiny. Wood relics appeared in churches, but when testable, tended to be driftwood or construction timber of uncertain provenance. The mountain was merciless to casual claims. There were good reasons for that failure rate. Ararat's upper slopes are an exposed amphitheater of time and weather. A heavy snow mantle and glacial flows shroud, grind, and reset surfaces every season. Volcanic rock fractures under freeze-thaw cycles. Ice rivers creep and calve. Until the age of aerial photography and later high-resolution satellite imagery, reliable surveying of the upper flanks was a near impossibility. Still, the conviction that the ark left its signature somewhere in Urartu did not dissipate. It migrated, diversified, and inspired new lines of inquiry. In 1959, Turkish Air Force Captain İlhan Durupinar, an expert in aerial photogrammetry, was analyzing reconnaissance imagery near Dogbayazit when an elongated prow-tapered outline seized his attention. On the ground, the feature measured about 164 meters, roughly 538 feet from stem to stern. Astonishingly, the Durupinar site in eastern Turkey matches exactly the 300 cubits, roughly 165 meters, described in Genesis for Noah's Ark. When the sloped earthen apron around the formation is excluded, its width-to-length ratio approaches 6:1, precisely the biblical proportion of 300 by 50 cubits. Even ground scans at the site reportedly show 3 distinct levels within a 15 to 16 meter vertical span, consistent with the ark's 3-deck, 30-cubit height. In the early 1960s, George Vandeman arranged surveys. Through the 1970s and 1980s, colorful and determined figures, Ron Wyatt, David Fassold, and others, pushed the site into headlines. They publicized metal detector hits, linear arrays that looked like ribs, drogue stones, large perforated monoliths in nearby villages proposed as anchor weights, and claims of embedded wood traces or petrified timber. Locals pointed to stones with chamfered holes as evidence of nautical function. The narrative cohered into an appealing tableau: a great ship fossilized in situ, its keel cradled by a natural berm, its anchor stones scattered downslope as the vessel grounded. For many who had longed for a tangible ark, Durapinar felt like a door swung open. Skeptics answered with geology. The site sits on complexly deformed terrain, metamorphosed ultramafic rock, including peridotite, colluvial fans and lava-intruded sequences jostled by regional faulting. Erosion and landslip can generate boat-like outlines, especially where a harder caprock protects a softer infill. To a structural geologist, the ribs read as tension cracks and bedding planes, the keelson as a drainage swale or a resistant seam. The so-called drogue stones are local volcanic or sedimentary monoliths, ubiquitous in the highlands, repurposed across centuries for religious or practical ends. And while some tests reported wood signatures, independent sampling frequently returned ambiguous organics, iron oxides from soils, or false positives driven by natural mineralization. Fasold himself later tempered his certitude. The mainstream view in geology and Near Eastern archaeology coalesced. The Durapinar Formation is best explained as a natural geological phenomenon, fascinating, photogenic, suggestive, but not demonstrably a man-made hull. The debate continues, not least because Durapinar is legible, anyone can see the boat shape, and narrative power counts for more in the public square than in a peer review. Meanwhile, the Ararat Summit hypothesis persists along a separate track. In 1949, U.S. Air Force aerial reconnaissance captured an intriguing rectilinear Ararat anomaly on the western plateau, about 2 kilometers from the summit. Subsequent passes, by spy planes and later civilian satellites, occasionally teased out box-like shadows under snow. Add the mountain's deep cultural magnetism, and you have a perfect recipe for recurring claims. A wood-lined cavity glimpsed in a melt year, a roofline emerging after an ice event, a long dark bar embedded in fern. The intrinsic problem is preservation. A wooden superstructure exposed within the zone of active glaciation is a poor candidate to survive millennia of ice creep, avalanches, seismic pulses, and thermal stress. But if timbers were entombed in a sheltered lava tube or a crevasse-sheltered pocket, the survival odds rise slightly. The hypothesis remains open enough to inspire fresh reconnaissance seasons whenever permissions, weather, and funding align. The mountains of Ararat stand, white-crowned and wind-carved, holding their secrets tightly. And somewhere within that plural, on a ridge line the sun touches last, or in a black chamber of rock and ice, the world's most storied timbers may yet wait for the day when method, season, and providence align. Though the story of Noah's Ark is a spectacular one, scholars long insisted that it did not actually take place, that the story was little more than myth. However, this opinion began to change in the year 2000, when 2 geologists from Columbia University named Walter Pittman and William Ryan began a study of core samples taken from beneath the Black Sea. Shockingly, they discovered that dozens of feet below the current seafloor was a layer of mud typically found in river deltas, and within this layer, shells of mollusks which are found in fresh water. This suggested that at some point in the past, the Black Sea was not the saltwater body it is today, but a freshwater lake which supported an area of rich farmland. Armed with this information and other geological evidence from the region collected by previous studies, Pittman and Ryan began to construct an incredible theory on what had happened. Sometime in the past, they proclaimed, the Black Sea had been a freshwater lake separated from the saltwater Mediterranean Sea by a strip of land known as the Bosporus Strait. At the end of the last ice age, approximately 10,000 years ago, when the ice sheets in the northern hemisphere began to melt and global water levels began to rise, the water level in the Mediterranean Sea rose so much that it broke through the Bosporus Strait, flooding the Black Sea area below. Without warning, water would have begun pouring through the breach with more than 200 times the force of Niagara Falls. In a single day, enough water would have entered the Black Sea basin to cover an area the size of Manhattan to a depth of more than 3,000 feet. Within a year, some 6,000 square miles of land would have disappeared underwater. This staggering theory immediately caught the attention of the world's most famous marine scientist, Robert Ballard. Ballard had been the man to track down the sunken remains of the Titanic in 1985, as well as numerous other lost wrecks around the world. With Pittman and Ryan's research in hand, Ballard traveled to the Black Sea to study the theory further. He and his team began to map the landscape of the seafloor with a sonar scanner mounted to a ship. In short order, they found something which stunned them more than 300 feet below the surface. There, on the seafloor, were the remains of an ancient building. Exploring further, the team noted the remnants of stone tools and ceramics scattered throughout the surrounding area. What this meant was clear. In the words of Robert Ballard, what we are looking at is a culture that is definitely thousands of years old. For us to find a structure in 150 meters of water means that these people were definitely living there before it flooded. But they did not stop there. Going further, they conducted carbon dating on the shells of the freshwater mollusks previously noted by Pittman and Ryan, as well as the shells of saltwater mollusks found in the layers of the seafloor above. Incredibly, they found that not only were the freshwater mollusks universally older than the saltwater ones, but that all of the freshwater mollusks were the same age, meaning they had died at the same time. For Ballard, this proved that they had died as a result of a sudden flood, since if they had died slowly due to gradually rising water, their ages would have been different. For the first time, definitive proof had emerged of a flood in the Black Sea region, one which certainly could have formed the foundation of the biblical story of Noah's Ark. However, many scientists insisted that there was one crucial inconsistency. While this evidence showed a regional flood, it did not provide evidence for the global flood described in the Bible, where, as Genesis states, the waters rose greatly on the earth and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The thing is, the Bible is not the only place that a global flood story appears. In fact, within cultures all over the world and all across history, a similar story exists. From the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, to the ancient Aztecs, Mayans, and Incans of Central and South America, to India and China, Native American tribes, and Australian Aboriginals. What is most astonishing is that not only do all of these cultures have a flood story, but in nearly every one, the story tells of a singular figure, like Noah and his family surviving the flood, almost always on a boat. Interestingly, in the years since Ballard, Pittman, and Ryan showed that a cataclysmic flood had taken place in the Black Sea region, similar evidence has started to emerge from locales around the world, in places where these similar global flood myths have long existed. In 2016, researchers in China discovered evidence of a catastrophic flood that raised water levels some 800 feet in the Yellow River Valley many thousands of years ago, seeming to confirm the historical basis of China's flood myth with its own Noah-like figure, Emperor Yu. In 2020, evidence emerged of a massive flood in the central Andean Plateau in South America, where the Incas once spoke of a family who survived a global flood sometime deep in the past. In 2023, researchers in India announced they had confirmed the ancient Hindu myth in which a figure named Manu survives a global flood by uncovering evidence of a flood so great that it led to the disappearance of the Saraswati River thousands of years ago. It seems like almost every year, new evidence emerges which seems to confirm the global flood stories of cultures all around the world. Does this mean that the biblical story of Noah's Ark has been proven? We know for sure that a flood took place in the Black Sea region, and the more evidence which emerges, the more it seems like it really may have been a global flood, as the Bible says. In either case, there is one critical question to consider. How did cultures all across the world, cultures who never met each other, come up with the exact same story of a global flood survived by a special figure? Is it possible that the story came from an older source? And if so, who? Long before recorded history, there were advanced ancient civilizations capable of building gigantic megalithic structures we can't build today, lifting enormous stone blocks weighing thousands of tons and stacking them with laser-like precision. Blocks we still struggle to lift even with our modern cranes. They crafted mathematically precise, flawless monuments from the hardest stone on Earth, leaving us to wonder who these builders were and how they accomplished the impossible. Were they merely primitive societies, or were they masters of a forgotten technology lost to the sands of time? Uncover the evidence of an ancient, global, and technologically sophisticated civilization that once ruled over our planet, constructing gigantic sites the ruins of which are still standing, before a cataclysmic event erased it from memory. Access our eBook, Prehistoric Megastructures, a nearly 500-page volume packed with images and in-depth analysis of some of the most astonishing and unexplained ancient structures ever discovered, monuments that were clearly built with advanced technology from a time long forgotten. There's a limited discount on the ebook, so make sure to get yours before it's too late.